The palace gleams in candlelight, gowns whisper across marble floors, jewels glitter in the firelight, and courtiers bow to their radiant queen. To the outside world, this is the height of beauty, the essence of refinement. But lean closer, step past the perfume, past the paint, past the layers of silk, and suddenly the illusion shatters. The queen reeks, her breath is foul, her skin festers beneath poison cosmetics, and the silken bed where she lies is alive with lice. Royal women were worshipped as visions of purity, elegance, and grace. Yet behind closed doors their hygiene habits were grotesque. Some believed water itself was dangerous and refused to bathe more than once a year. Others coated their faces in lead and arsenic, knowing it scarred their flesh, but desperate to appear pale and youthful. Some urinated in palace corners rather than walk to a chamber pot. Others slept in sheets so foul they could stand upright on their own. To be royal was to shine, but the truth? Royals stank, and the women who ruled kingdoms and dazzled courts often carried bodies filthier than the peasants they looked down upon. Tonight we open the doors to their chambers, peel back the painted masks, and uncover the 10 most disgusting hygiene habits of royal women. If you enjoy hidden truths like this, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because the crown may glitter, but it smells of rot. To understand why the hygiene of royal women was so revolting, we need to step back into their world, into a time when filth was not only tolerated but often celebrated as a mark of nobility. Palaces might have glittered with gold, but the air inside was thick with stench, and the queens and princesses we imagine as flawless angels were often at the very center of that smell. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, bathing was a suspicious act. Doctors warned that warm water could weaken the body, open pores, and let deadly vapors seep in. For women, the dangers were said to be even greater. Midwives and physicians claimed that immersion in water might harm fertility or damage the womb. And so, many royal women avoided baths almost entirely. To step into water was not just frowned upon, it was feared. Instead, they turned to substitutes. Perfumes, powders, and oils were rubbed onto unwashed skin. Dresses were layered thick, covering odors that would otherwise have been unbearable. The more silks and brocades a woman wore, the less she needed to confront the stink beneath. Ironically, the very peasants working the fields, who had no perfumes or silks, often bathed in rivers far more often than queens. In those days, dirt itself became a kind of status symbol. To smell clean was peasant work. To smell of perfume masking sweat and rot, that was royal. The illusion, however, was fragile. Underneath the jewels and gowns, skin was often cracked, infested with lice and marked with sores. Servants who brushed the wigs of noblewomen often found crawling insects hidden in powdered curls. One servant described the court of France as glittering above, crawling beneath. Still, no one dared to speak openly. To suggest that a queen stank was to risk your life. Perfume became the mask that hid it all. Royal women drowned themselves in it. Catherine de' Medici was said to have invented personal perfume bottles she carried everywhere, reapplying constantly. Visitors often gagged from the overwhelming clouds of scent, but Catherine believed it was necessary, because beneath the roses and lavender, her body had gone untouched by water for months. She was not alone. Across Europe, perfumes were so heavily applied that courtiers fainted at banquets, choking on the haze of oils and powders that hung in the air. The French court at Versailles stands as one of the clearest examples of this grotesque contrast between beauty and decay. Its golden halls, painted ceilings, and manicured gardens dazzled foreign visitors. But letters from ambassadors tell another story. With so few latrines for hundreds of nobles, men and women relieved themselves in hallways, stairwells, even behind curtains. Chamber pots overflowed. Servants were left to mop up filth as best they could, while the stench of waste lingered in the very heart of the palace. Versailles was the symbol of elegance, but its halls smelled like a sewer. Cosmetics made the illusion even worse. Pale skin was a mark of nobility, so royal women smeared their faces with white powders made of lead, mercury, and arsenic. These paints cracked and poisoned the skin, leaving sores, rashes, and scars. Rather than abandon the practice, women simply applied more paint. Some used pigeon droppings or ground animal parts as treatments, convinced they would make the skin soft. The cost of beauty was flesh itself, and many queens paid with disfigurement or even death. Teeth were no better. Without modern brushing, mouths rotted quickly. Herbs, cloths, and powders were sometimes rubbed across teeth, but the effect was limited. Queen Elizabeth I of England was infamous for her blackened teeth. Foreign envoys dreaded standing close to her because of the smell of her breath. Yet in portraits she appeared radiant, her decay hidden behind paint and jewels. That was the story of royal hygiene in a single image, the surface gleaming, the body beneath falling apart. Beds and clothing told their own horrors. Linens were rarely changed. Some queens wore undergarments until they disintegrated. Maids sometimes discovered mattresses crawling with lice and fleas. Washing fabrics was considered dangerous for health, so instead they were beaten, shaken, and sprayed with perfumes. Dirt was never removed, only disguised. These habits were not accidents, they were culture. A royal woman was raised to believe her body was sacred, too noble for water, too refined for peasant cleanliness. Filth was prestige, perfume was power, and any attempt to live differently could provoke suspicion or scandal. A clean body might mean a guilty soul. This was the world of royal women, a world where queens who dazzled in portraits smelled of rot in person, where the most powerful women in Europe lived in filth unimaginable today. And this world is the stage for the 10 most disgusting hygiene habits in history. The curtains are drawn, the powder is thick, the perfume is choking, but the truth is only just beginning to seep out. From the moment they were born, royal women were trained to project perfection. Their lives were orchestrated like theatre, every movement rehearsed, every smile practiced. They were taught to sit gracefully, to speak with charm, to wear the latest silks, and to carry themselves as though they were chosen by God. But what they were not taught was how to care for their own bodies. Hygiene was considered irrelevant, even vulgar. A princess did not scrub herself in rivers like peasants. She did not bend down to wash her own hair or change her own sheets. Those tasks fell to servants, who were expected to handle the filth quietly, without ever mentioning it aloud. A royal woman's body was not her own responsibility. It belonged to the crown, and its image mattered far more than its reality. As children, these women were swaddled in layers of expensive fabrics that were rarely washed. Their hair was dusted with powders to keep it looking pale and fashionable, even as lice thrived underneath. They learned to cover odors with perfume rather than water. By adolescence, their skin was already damaged from powders laced with mercury and lead. Some developed rashes and sores that never healed. But rather than stop, they simply applied more paint. At court, this was considered normal, even admirable. A woman who reeked of musk and roses, who carried herself in gowns stiff with sweat and dirt, was seen as aristocratic. A woman who washed too often might be whispered about as unholy or reckless. Cleanliness was a suspicious trait, one that blurred the line between royalty and peasantry. To remain unwashed was to remain above. In public, the illusion held. Portraits painted their faces as smooth, pale, and flawless. Poets praised their divine fragrance, though in private the stench was unbearable. Diplomats wrote letters describing the overpowering odors of court gatherings, yet the deception endured because image was everything. No one wanted to admit that the women who embodied the grace of kingdoms smelled like decay. Behind closed doors, however, these women suffered. Diaries and letters from ladies-in-waiting describe constant itching, bleeding gums, and the shame of carrying parasites beneath wigs. Some women confessed to spitting wine onto palace floors to mask the taste of rotting teeth. Others admitted to sleeping in beds so damp and foul they struggled to rest. Yet they had no choice. To deviate from custom was to risk ridicule. To bathe was to risk gossip. To be clean was to be suspect. And so, from birth to adulthood, royal women rose into their roles draped in jewels, painted in poison and drenched in perfume. Their beauty was a performance, their elegance was a mask, and their habits were already preparing the stage for darker consequences. The rise was dazzling, but the fall would be far filthier. The illusion of elegance could only last so long. For centuries, royal women were seen as the jewels of their courts, but beneath the silks and pearls, their bodies began to betray the very ideals they were meant to embody. The turning point came when their hygiene habits, or lack of them, stopped being invisible and instead became impossible to ignore. One of the most notorious examples was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The Virgin Queen dazzled with her brilliant gowns, her powdered face, and her regal posture. But behind the spectacle, Elizabeth was hiding a horrifying truth. She was terrified of bathing. She believed that water seeped into the skin and spread sickness through the body. So she bathed only once a month, and sometimes less. As years passed, her teeth blackened, rotted, and fell out. Her skin grew pocked with sores from toxic lead makeup. Ambassadors reported that her breath was so foul it was unbearable to stand near her, yet she still painted her face white, applied perfumes to cover the stench, and demanded that courtiers pretend nothing was wrong. In France, Queen Marie Antoinette became infamous not only for her extravagance but also for her peculiar routines. Though Versailles was a palace of gold, it was also a cesspit of filth. Toilets overflowed, chamber pots spilled, and courtiers relieved themselves in hallways. Marie herself rarely bathed, preferring instead to wipe her body with scented cloths. She powdered her hair into elaborate towers that sometimes went weeks without being cleaned, attracting lice and even small mice. The same woman who symbolized beauty and excess was in reality living in a haze of perfume and vermin. Even earlier, Catherine de' Medici of France introduced a trend that would devastate women for centuries: poisonous perfumes and cosmetics. Obsessed with appearance, Catherine popularized powders made of mercury and arsenic, which her ladies applied daily. These chemicals corroded the skin, inflamed the eyes, and rotted the flesh beneath their painted faces. Women wore wigs to cover bald spots caused by poisoning. They painted red lips to hide bleeding gums and blackened teeth. Beauty was maintained at the cost of their health, and the court became a theater of suffering disguised as glamour. The turning point wasn't just personal, it was political. As ambassadors, visitors, and writers began to describe the stench and filth of European courts, the myth of royal purity began to unravel. Stories circulated of Russian tsarinas who refused to bathe in winter, believing the cold water would kill them. German duchesses were said to wear the same undergarments for months, stiff with sweat and grime. Spanish queens reportedly soaked themselves in perfume so thick it left greasy stains on everything they touched. The higher their rank, the less likely they were to touch water. Cleanliness became a mark of low birth. Dirt, oddly enough, became a badge of nobility. And yet cracks appeared. Servants whispered. Physicians worried. Lovers recoiled. In some cases, the filth itself played a role in history. Elizabeth I's rotting teeth left her unable to eat properly, weakening her health in her final years. Marie Antoinette's lack of hygiene, combined with France's festering palace conditions, became symbolic of aristocratic rot, a stench that fueled revolutionary anger. Catherine de' Medici's poisonous cosmetics left her court ravaged by disease and deformity, creating whispers of witchcraft and curses that haunted her legacy. These were no longer harmless eccentricities. They were obsessions, betrayals of the body, and ticking time bombs of decay. For the first time, the world began to see that the queens and princesses worshipped as untouchable symbols of perfection were just as human and just as foul as anyone else. Their vanity, their fear, and their devotion to image had turned them into prisoners of filth. What began as performance had transformed into pathology. Their beauty routines were killing them. Their perfume-choked halls became unbearable to guests. Their rotting teeth, infected skin, and infested hair became metaphors for kingdoms on the brink of collapse. And in that grotesque transformation, a dangerous truth revealed itself. The women who ruled were no longer only endangering themselves. Their filth had consequences on health, on politics, on the very stability of their crowns. The turning point had come. What followed would be darker, uglier, and deadlier than anyone at court dared to admit. The masks of perfume and powder could not hold forever. In the end, the stench always broke through. And when it did, the consequences were not just embarrassing, they were catastrophic. For Elizabeth I, her fear of water became a prison. In her later years, courtiers described her as a shadow of her former self. Her skin, once painted into an illusion of porcelain, cracked and peeled from decades of corrosive cosmetics. Her teeth, black and rotted, made speech painful, and her breath was so foul that ambassadors dreaded audiences with her. The queen who had ruled over the golden age of England now sat isolated, her beauty gone, her body decayed, and her subjects whispering of witchcraft. The Virgin Queen's filth became a metaphor for the rot that would soon grip her kingdom after her death. In France, the Palace of Versailles reeked. Its golden halls glittered with chandeliers, but the floors were soaked with urine, and the air stank of unwashed bodies. Marie Antoinette, painted as the jewel of the French court, lived in chambers buzzing with fleas and lice. Perfumed cloths could not hide the truth. When revolution swept through France, pamphlets mocked her as a foul, decadent parasite, a queen who feasted while her people starved, who powdered her hair while vermin crawled beneath it. Her unhygienic habits, exaggerated though they were, became propaganda for the guillotine. Her filth was not just physical, it became political poison. Elsewhere in Europe, queens met darker fates. Catherine de' Medici's poisonous beauty standards disfigured generations of noble women. The obsession with pale skin and scarlet lips produced a court full of walking corpses. Women whose faces blistered beneath their paint, whose hair fell out in clumps, whose gums bled when they smiled. Some died young of mercury poisoning, their beauty routines leaving them emaciated, delirious, and infertile. Catherine herself was blamed for curses, for witchcraft, for bringing death into her court, but the truth was worse. It was vanity, not sorcery, that destroyed them. In Russia, the tsarinas of the 18th century became infamous for their stench. Foreign diplomats wrote disgusted reports of women who had not bathed in months, whose gowns were soiled with food and sweat. One tsarina, Anna Ivanovna, was said to have worn the same linen for weeks at a time, her bed crawling with vermin. The empire's rulers, feared across Europe for their armies, were mocked for smelling like beggars. And behind the mockery was a dangerous truth. Their refusal to embrace basic hygiene left them vulnerable to infections, disease, and infertility. In a world where dynasties depended on heirs, filth could change history. The consequences were not always visible in life. Sometimes they appeared only in death. When the tombs of certain queens were opened centuries later, chroniclers noted the shocking state of their remains. Bones corroded by mercury, teeth blackened into stumps, traces of lead embedded deep within the skull. The poisons of beauty, the neglect of hygiene had scarred them beyond the grave. But the darkest consequence of all was not physical, it was symbolic. For centuries, royal women had been upheld as ideals of purity, grace, and moral superiority. When their private filth became public knowledge, it shattered the myth of divine monarchy. How could a queen who stank of sweat and vermin claim to be chosen by God? How could a dynasty present itself as holy when its princesses painted their faces with poison and refused to wash? The revelation of filth stripped the crown of its mystique. It turned reverence into ridicule, awe into disgust. The people saw the truth. The rot of royalty was not hidden behind gold and jewels anymore. It was on their skin, in their teeth, in their very breath. The crown, once sacred, now stank of corruption, literally. And when the myth collapsed, it dragged entire kingdoms down with it. These were the dark consequences of filth disguised as elegance. Perfume could no longer cover the decay. Poison could no longer preserve the illusion. The queens who had been symbols of majesty became symbols of rot. But history doesn't end with their downfall. The stench of their choices lingers, carrying lessons we still ignore today. When the perfume faded and the paint peeled away, the women beneath the crowns were revealed not as flawless icons, but as frail, suffering humans. And in that revelation lies the most haunting truth of all. Take Elizabeth I's history remembers her as the Gloriana, the virgin queen who defied kings and ruled an empire, but behind her portraits of radiant majesty was a woman crippled by fear of sickness, fear of aging, fear of losing the beauty that gave her authority. Her refusal to bathe, her dependence on toxic cosmetics, were not acts of arrogance alone. They were desperate measures in a world where a woman's worth, even a queen's, was measured by her appearance. In the end, her body rotted beneath her crown. She may have ruled a golden age, but she died in private misery, her flesh ruined by the very rituals that made her untouchable. Marie Antoinette's fate was even more brutal. To her people, she became the symbol of aristocratic decay. Pamphlets painted her not just as wasteful but as filthy, a queen wallowing in perfume while her kingdom starved. Her hygiene habits, whether exaggerated or not, became proof that she was unfit to rule, unfit even to live. When the guillotine fell in 1793, it was not just punishment for extravagance. It was vengeance against a queen whose very body had come to represent the rot of monarchy. Catherine de' Medici's court, haunted by death and disease, shows us another lesson. The poisonous beauty standards she embraced destroyed the women who followed them. Their blistered skin, bald scalps, and wasted bodies were not simply the results of ignorance. They were the cost of obedience in a system that demanded women sacrifice health for appearance. Catherine herself became a figure of suspicion, accused of sorcery, of bringing curses upon France. But what really cursed her court was vanity weaponized by power. Even in Russia, the stench of unwashed tsarinas stained the dynasty's image. The empire could project might abroad, but in the privacy of its palaces, filth ruled. Vermin, disease, and rot thrived where soap and water were absent. The women who could have been symbols of divine authority became objects of ridicule, weakening the aura of sacred monarchy. Their refusal to care for their own bodies fed the perception that they could not care for their people either. And so we return to the question, what do these revolting habits teach us? On one level, they are reminders of how far we have come. Modern standards of hygiene, daily bathing, clean linens, safe cosmetics, are luxuries that royalty themselves once lacked. But on another level, these stories warn us about the dangers of illusion. Power often hides behind a mask. Perfume covers stench, paint covers rotes. Ritual covers fear, but the truth always seeps through, and when it does, the consequences can be devastating. The royal women we've uncovered tonight were not monsters. They were victims of their time, trapped in roles that valued appearance over health, image over reality. They were raised to be symbols, not people, and in chasing that impossible perfection, they destroyed themselves. Their crowns glittered, but their bodies paid the price. And perhaps the darkest lesson of all is this: filth is never just physical, it becomes symbolic. A queen who refuses to bathe can become the symbol of a kingdom that refuses to reform. A princess who poisons her skin for beauty can become the metaphor for a society poisoning itself with lies. In the end, hygiene, or the lack of it, shaped history. It toppled thrones, it fueled revolutions, it exposed the rot behind the crown. So the next time you see a portrait of a flawless queen, with her ivory skin and jeweled gown, remember the truth that lingers beneath the paint, the lice, the sores, the rotting teeth, the chamber pots spilled in golden halls. Remember that power itself often smells worse than decay. The crown was never clean. Subscribe for more, share this story, and tell me in the comments what shocked you most, because history is full of masks, and behind them the truth always stinks.